Welcome to a podcast brought to you by the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists. Our academy is a national organization committed to excellence in orthopedic manual physical therapy practice, education, and research, and we're here to explore a wide range of topics with you through interviews with content experts.
Hello, my name is Stephen Shaffer, and I'm pleased to bring to you an interview with our very own Dr. Kevin MacPherson. That's right, today's guest is a voice you already know and love. Dr. MacPherson is one of our hosts, and he has been with us since the beginning. However, today he's going to be in the interviewee's seat. I asked Kevin to join the podcast as a guest because I recently came across a study from last year that he was the primary author of. This study, which was published in the Journal of Manual and Manipulative Therapy, was titled Perceptions of the Professional and Personal Impact of Hybrid Fellowship Training, a Qualitative Study. Before we get started, let me first tell you a bit more about the guy that's normally telling you a bit more about our guests. Dr. Kevin MacPherson is both a clinical lecturer and the Assistant Director of Clinical Education at the University of Florida, which also happens to be the same university and program that he graduated from with his entry-level physical therapy training. Since that initial graduation, he has also obtained a post-professional clinical doctorate of physical therapy, became a board-certified specialist in orthopedics, and a fellow of the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists. Perhaps most important to the podcast, I happen to think he's a spectacular host, and I can also tell you that he is superbly good at holding my feet to the fire when doing so is required. With that as our introduction, let's avoid any further delay and get to the interview. Dr. MacPherson, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Pretty good, Steve. I'm enjoying the social isolation and the stir craziness that comes with it. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Also, in some ways, enjoying that isolation, but I'm itching to get back to work sometime soon. I just wish I knew when that was going to be.
Yeah, we're in the same boat south of the border with the students not there. I don't get a chance to work with the students, and our pro bono clinic is also shut down. So my current main interface with patients is also lacking. So I'm ready for some normalcy again.
Speaking of normalcy, this is by no means a normal situation, my friend, because normally you are the interrogator and there's someone else in the hot seat. But today you are the one under scrutiny. How does it feel, my friend, to be in the hot seat today?
Well, until you said all of that, I was feeling fine. Now I might have broken a slight sweat. So it's good. I'm looking forward to being on this side of the coin. And one of the things that we don't get a chance to see is how some of the other interviewers handle the process. So I think that part ought to be pretty interesting in and of itself. But, I've come to be used to your very calming voice, and I look forward to the interview.
Thank you, sir. And I could say that right back at you. And in terms of how I like to approach an interview, sometimes my favorite question to start with is what inspired this research project? And in your case, I know that you're fellowship trained and that you've taught at the fellowship level. And I was just wondering, is that what prompted you to conduct this study, or was there some other driving force behind the project?
I would say that the universe, per usual, came together, and that's what drove this study. Background-wise, around that time, they were going through a excellence in teaching research set of modules at the University of Florida, where I'm currently housed. And one of the main subjects that came through that was how to perform qualitative research. At the same time, one of the co-authors, Kim Dunleavy, she has had a background in qualitative research, so she was familiar with those processes. Now, the catalyst for it really moving forward is the same catalyst that many of our studies start off with, and that is a beer at the end of the day at a AOMPT conference. So I was sitting with Julie Whitman, and she was going over some of the preliminary findings from their survey data for this same hybrid fellowship, and mentioned that they saw some interesting things regarding a question. And the question was, rate the impact of fellowship on your development as a person. And most of the respondents said that there was a large impact. But just like most quantitative research, there's a fair amount of how much or what being answered with the research question, not so much the why or the depth that can come with the quantitative research. So that led to a discussion about, hey, I'm looking at qualitative research. I think it would be really good if we could follow up that question with some of the respondents. And that's where we ended up leading to.
That sounds like a great way to start a project, and certainly it's a process familiar to myself as well. And if we could just dive in a little bit deeper, we can easily note that in the title of your paper, you use the word hybrid. And I'm sure there are some people out in our audience, both American and our international audience, that aren't familiar with what the word hybrid means when it comes to fellowship training. So can you describe that and tell us a little bit about this type of fellowship education approach and why it is a true hybrid?
Sure. So the term hybrid comes more from the educational research and educational philosophy, where traditional teaching happens to be more of that sitting in a lecture hall, listening to the presentation, doing homework on the side. With the hybrid model, there is a little bit more of a blended approach where there's a remote aspect to it or a flipped aspect to it. So the educational model is delivered at home. And when the students meet with their instructors, there is more of a dynamic about that didactic work that was provided remotely or at home. So one of the large issues that we have with fellowship training and arguably also residency training in the US is that you typically have to give up whatever you're doing career-wise or business-wise or employer-wise and move to a residency facility or a company that provides residency and or fellowship. And that just, there was a big void with this because there are a lot of people who desire to have a much higher level of practice, but they didn't have the ability to just pack their bags and move to a new city in order to complete that training. So the specific program that we worked with for this research was a company that really developed this model with the idea in mind of we need to make sure that we're helping out our profession and we're not leaving anybody behind because of some of these things. So it created a program where you do the vast majority of your lecture or didactic material through recorded lectures independently. There are meeting times and small group projects and individual projects that require interfacing at certain times per the week during a semester that allows for that higher level knowledge application to occur. And then there are also remote sessions with higher level mentors that really go over cases that you present in your practice and really goes through the same process that a normal fellowship would go through, where it breaks down the errors and flaws in your reasoning and tries to teach you how to reflect deeper at it. The other part that brings things together is AOMT rightfully requires one-on-one in-person assessment of the student skill and also the mentor skill, but the student's skill. So you have live in-person sessions in which the students will either go to a clinic and work with a fellow mentor, or they will ask the fellow mentor to come to their clinic and work with them. So, which is very different than the standard model where you are working your quote unquote submerged into the facility that has the residency by moving to that facility.
That was a great summary. Thank you very much for giving that to our audience. I guess I'm not 100% sure about your background, but in my case, I've studied in both types of programs, and I see the strengths and weaknesses in both. And, in the end, I feel like I gained a lot from each program I studied in, so I have no regrets about the choices I made. But I can imagine people struggle a lot with that decision, which type of program, which location, what am I able to do, what am I not able to do? And in my case, I moved across the country twice for 2 different programs. And then the third program I completed was more of a hybrid. So again, I've seen both and I like both, but it's always just an interesting question. Which should we do? Which shouldn't we do?
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting in general because there's actually another podcast in our pipeline that goes over some of the differences between a traditional model and a hybrid model. They don't use those terms, but Greg Hartley's interview really discusses that. So once that's published, I recommend anybody who's listening that's interested in this hybrid and more standard or traditional models to listen to that. That is focused more towards residency, but I have done most of my postgraduate training through remote models. So my transitional doctorate was through St. Augustine, through a remote model where you did have to attend their clinical education courses, specifically focused on orthopedic manual therapy. And then my residency, not residency, my fellowship was through Regis University, which is also a hybrid model where I did a lot of the coursework online, and then I would fly in or work within weekend intensives for that one-on-one interaction. Now, what gives me kind of the somewhat more the instructor insight is that I did provide fellow mentorship for a in-house fellowship, which was the University of Illinois at Chicago's fellowship when I was a clinician within their outpatient facility. So I was able to both teach in a hybrid model and the traditional model. And just like you said, Steve, I saw a lot of good things in one model. I saw a lot of good things in the other model. So there's pluses and minuses. But the thing that I think really I would tend to draw somebody's attention to when they're trying to determine which model works for them is their life situation. I think had you, Steve, had either a sick mom that you had to attend to at the end of the day or over weekends or a family with 3 kids, there might be a challenge with having made those moves to undergo your in-house training. Again, I'm making probably a very blind statement there. So by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of those other aspects are what really jumps into line and makes people look at the hybrid model with a little bit more satisfaction.
For the record, your assumptions are completely correct. And I've always felt, I don't know what the right word is, maybe grateful, maybe selfish, maybe lucky, I'm not sure, that I was able to basically pick up my entire life and move for different programs. For the third one, I was in a place where I couldn't do that. But as a quick note before we dive any deeper, I just want to point out that the Hartley interview that you made reference to is episode 43 and was published on June 11th. So the audience, if they want to listen to that, if they haven't already, they can go to any one of the podcast feeds that we have and find that in our lineup. For the next point, I want to talk about something that's relevant, of course, in the United States to both of the models that we were just talking about. And that is, in the United States, if you go complete fellowship or residency training, you don't actually get to bill at a higher rate. And luckily for me right now, that's not true in Canada, which is actually one of the reasons I moved to Canada, was the whole billing, insurance, direct access type conversation. Can you talk for a moment about how that impacts our profession and quite honestly also can potentially impact our patients?
Yeah, we are living in really a failed model. Physical therapists are paid to do and not paid to get good outcomes. And luckily, there is some shift in that model when they are looking at new payment systems or new reimbursement methodologies. So I do think there's a chance that will change in the future, but it has been one of the biggest knocks. And to be honest with you, when I was trying to pitch for my employer to help me out with fellowship, they didn't really see the benefit because it didn't change what I could bill. It only turned the coin when I talked about some of the additional benefits I could bring to that company after fellowship, such as creating different courses that can be provided to the other employees, really trying to enhance clinical practice through different strategic systems-based changes, such as better utilization of outcomes measures. So I had to pitch that this was better for the entire company versus, now I'm here, I bill at a higher rate, you can take a cut of a larger payment. Now, one of the things that did, however, kind of balance out that lack of bump in clinical pay that you would expect with higher level training with our research was, having completed the fellowship, there were more of those opportunities to teach in other facilities or for other companies or for other associations, which provided the graduates who we interviewed a chance to create different revenue streams for their income. So there were opportunities there. A lot of them ended up moving out of clinical practice and into academia, which now you basically have a set salary and there's no productivity outside of publication, which arguably can be just as hard. But so there were ways around it, but it is disappointing that in the current state, we still don't get a bump for the outcomes. Now, the trade-off that I do see, however, with some of the models coming forward is one of the things that happens as soon as you become a fellow is you start getting the difficult patients or the more complex patient presentations. And I think the current thought process on trying to improve payments for outcomes really needs to take into account that fellows oftentimes are going to get very complex patients as their skill set becomes more, the community around them becomes more aware of it.
That's certainly a trend that I've seen in my clinical practice. And just to give you a little side story here that's related to the situation you were talking about, one of the last jobs that I worked clinically in the United States, I showed up at the clinic, and to be honest, I think it was roughly half full in terms of the patient caseload. And I worked there for, a handful of months. I got the caseload completely full, in part, I think, because I was helping people, I was making them better. And, they go and they tell their neighbors, their friends, their family, their coworkers. So then more people started streaming into the clinic. However, because I'm not a new graduate that sees 2 patients at a time and does a lot of, higher reimbursement hands-off treatments, my actual income for the clinic was a little bit lower. As a matter of fact, if I remember the exact phrasing, the manager said I was the lowest grossing therapist in the state. So even though I filled the clinic, they terminated my contract because they just weren't interested in the quality component of the physical therapy. They only wanted the financial numbers to look a certain way. And I found that very troubling.
Yeah, that is actually one of the primary reasons why I left clinical practice as a whole and moved into academia, because it was just frustrating to work for larger companies that really had an emphasis on the bottom line and not on the quality associated with the bottom line. And I'm not going to dog those companies, since the primary function of a business oftentimes is to make money. That is unfortunately the goal there. But I would say that it's not every company. There are definitely companies out there that are more interested in having quality over that quantity and that ultimate bottom dollar, but they are a little bit fewer and farther between.
Before we get too sidetracked in all of these topics, let's go back a little bit here. And why don't you tell us about the study design in terms of this particular research study, and then we'll dive more into the results.
Yes, Steve. So this was a qualitative research study, and the format for qualitative research is really trying to elucidate something that is in either the researcher's mind, a subtle observation, or it's trying to work out the meaning behind quantitative research, which is what I previously described here. And so you set off about creating kind of in this case, we used a semi-structured interview process because we knew that there were some guiding questions that can be utilized to help start the conversation, of which one were the ratings that were received in that quantitative research study and how high they were without really giving us any data for it. We created a grouping of questions, and from there, we asked the program director to identify individuals who had graduated from the program and were at least a year out from the program to give them a little bit of time to really absorb what they really accomplished and gained from that experience, versus having a little bit of recency bias on whatever the most recent interaction during fellowship training was. So from there, we were able to identify 16 potential individuals for interviewing, and we were able to schedule 13. The process that we used really was to have our original questions. We started that with the interviewees, and if they provided any information that we can latch onto and expand upon, we did so. If they provided a completely different direction of discussion that was relevant to the primary question about rating your development as a person, status post intern or fellowship, that we were allowed to go down those rabbit holes with the interviewee. One of the differences you have with qualitative research is you're looking for some sort of threshold to stop recruitment, whereas with a quantitative research study, based off of a certain amount of change you're hoping to see or a certain amount of effect size, something along those lines, you have to predetermine your sample size. In this case, with qualitative research, you are looking really for what we would be called saturation, where you're not getting any new either themes or concepts coming out of the interviewees. So there's really a belief that you've kind of saturated the amount of information you're going to get out of this line of discussion. So you halt the process there. So we started off with the idea of let's do the 13. If we need to cut it off early, we can. If we need to add more, we can do that as well by reaching out to the director of the program. But it ended up turning out that the 13 was right around where we had saturation. It was a little bit before that, but we already had the 13 scheduled, so we finished that process. Once you do these interviews, then your team goes through the process of transcribing the interviews. And then we, as a group of interviewers, look for common threads, common statements that they may be different words, but they say the same thing. And that would be a theme that starts to develop. You start to have this overall, well, in this case, they're talking about how their practice has changed. In this case, they're talking about how their social interaction has changed. In this case, they're talking how their personal life has changed, which those three happen to be the main constructs that we saw with our interview process. But once you identify these themes, then your group of coders, which is a broader group, tend to now go back to the transcribed interviews and they look for other sentences or other statements that support that theme, while also looking to see if there's anything that was missed thematically through the interview, or through the transcribed interview process. Once it is all said and done, you kind of look at the results, and as a group we go through and we confirm those results and we say, yes, that does seem to fit this theme, that does seem to fit that theme. And when it's all said and done, you come out with overall or overarching constructs, in this case the practice, social, and personal impacts, and then you come up with sub themes, which I can get into if you'd like, or we can go through that in a different manner. And then you look for examples. So you write up your results, you look for the specific examples that really give a good indication to the reader what that theme is all about or what that sub-theme is all about, to give them examples of what the actual participants stated. And that really will help elucidate the meaning behind whatever the original research question was or whatever the original quantitative finding was.
It sounds like a very thorough process, and you've already started to slightly characterize the results. You mentioned that the effects of the training process were on practice, on social life, and on personal life. Can you dive a little deeper into what the actual results said? And for example, maybe you can tell us if there were any negative impacts of the fellowship training process, or were they all positive? Was it mixed? Just what was the overall result that you found?
Certainly. So if we start off with practice, the two main sub-themes that came out of that were time management, which you would expect to get better or more efficient with your evaluative process when you undergo and finish fellowship training. So a lot of this revolved around getting better at differential diagnosis and being really strategic in your questioning and in your objective testing. So there was that component of just hastening the ability to get that done in a rapid period of time. Practice also revealed a satisfaction, so that the clinicians were more satisfied with actual day-to-day practice. And this, when you look at some of the examples of this really panned out being there was more meaning to their interactions with patients because there was more thought placed into it. They actually were reasoning through the patient, as opposed to maybe that default or defunct, I get paid to do, so I'm just going to do with a patient. Here, they were actually trying to get more into the why based off of some of the examples that they had. Now, the social aspect of this, or the social construct, one of the things that came across that really ties in actually to the Hartley interview was connectedness. So this specific hybrid model, there was a lot of effort placed into making sure that the learners felt that they were part of a community. So that was done through creating student groups where they were meeting together. That was done through making sure that there was a Facebook page that they could ask questions or seek out articles from. It was done through making sure that there were events at the different conferences that allowed these students to get together. And, having been around this model or this specific program, you see that it's interesting how many times you can go to a conference, and when the group gets together, you'll hear people say, I feel like I know you, even though this is the first time I'm meeting you in person. So there was connectedness that they found, but they found this connectedness also outside of the program and after. So there was still that continued, I'm still part of this Facebook page, I'm still interacting. There was also still that continued, I'm seeing the same group of new fellows in training from my fellowship when I come back to the conference get-togethers. The connectedness kind of ranged out a little bit from there as well. A lot of the mentors within this specific program had connections with other higher level researchers or higher level association members and whatnot. So that allowed a little bit greater connection with these supposedly external individuals that would arguably be called leaders of the profession. And it resulted in them having the ability to kind of move into projects and move into different programs through those other more remote connections. The next one underneath the social construct would have been kind of their ability to actively and openly listen. So one of the key things that you learn in fellowship is how to do a subjective, but more importantly, how to shut your brain down during the subjective from this is what I'm going to ask next, and actually sit back and listen to the response, briefly consider the response, and then move into the next question, which is more of that reflection in practice as opposed to on practice. So that was enhanced. Now, this one was one of the ones where there was a little bit of potential negative to this, in that there was a tendency or reports from the interviewees that this ability to actively listen and be open with the listening was adapted to outside of the clinic. So they would actively listen to their spouse or to someone else, and it resulted in more questions, which oftentimes can lead into I don't want you to question me, I'm just telling you this, just listen to what I'm saying and don't move on to elaborating or asking for more elaborate information. So I thought that was kind of an interesting finding, which does kind of tie into the family construct or sub-theme for this social construct. The family was both negatively and positively impacted. A lot of times it was negatively impacted. And I say that in that fellows, once they're done with training for this model in specific, but also from anecdotal evidence from all programs, are more active individuals within their association, within their community, within different groupings, which means your time is divvied out and divvied away from your family potentially. So there were some negative aspects of, I don't see my family quite as much, even though I'm seeing them more than when I was in fellowship, because of all these new responsibilities, new activities. I don't have necessarily the same time to interact with my family. Now, the other side of that, which I kind of alluded to already, is the family connections were enhanced through the fellowship process. So once fellowship was done and some of that time was given back, now all of a sudden the fellow graduate really started to notice, like, I really like my family. I enjoy being with them. I need to really take advantage of that time that I have with them. So family had some interesting back and forth. When we look at the next construct, that was the personal construct, of which the primary one that came out of that was professional evolution. And this was really described primarily as openings in opportunity from a teaching standpoint, from a association participation standpoint, that seemed to have been driven by this almost near mimicry of the mentors. So a lot of the respondents for these specific subtheme subtheme options stated, like, well, I saw how much my mentors were involved, and I was like, I need to be that involved too. So there were definitely changes in that. There were also a lot of individuals who moved into academia from clinical practice, of which I've kind of described my process, even though I went through a different fellowship program than the one that was looked at here. Now, there was one individual who indicated kind of an interesting change in their professional evolution. They were a higher level manager with minimal patient care time. And as a result of the fellowship training, they realized how much they loved patient care, and that higher level that can occur once you know what you're supposed to be doing through fellowship training. So they actually ended up doing a step down and became more of a staff clinician after fellowship, so that they could utilize the skill set and really enjoy working with patients again. The last subtheme for that personal construct was self-awareness and metacognition. This one, you can't go through a fellowship program without hearing the word metacognition at some point. So it wasn't surprising to see this. What was interesting was kind of the self-awareness that was drawn out of clinical practice. So very similar to some of the social constructs with active and open listening, there was a lot of thought about things and a lot of questioning about things outside of clinical practice, such as different community activities or different family activities. So this resulted in a lot of reflection in action for non-clinical activities, which some of the respondents also said this can get you in trouble if you overthink everything. It almost makes you question nearly everything in your life. Not that it's wrong, but there are definitely times where it can be a little bit overkill. So those were the primary constructs and subthemes within those groupings of practice, social and personal.
I find that all to be super fascinating. And a big reason for that is, even though I didn't go to this hybrid program that you're describing, the results and the impacts on my life, professionally, personally, etc., pretty much mirror exactly what you just described. And if I could take it one step further, in my case in particular, I probably would have left the profession. I went into PT school thinking that I was going to learn how to fix people. I thought I was going to be essentially a mechanic for the human body. And just like you drop your car off at the auto shop and someone does some work and then it's better, I thought I was going to do that in the clinic. And that was just the naive, 18-year-old version of myself. Then I graduated and I realized it's a whole lot more complicated than I thought it was. And my clinical results were not great. And my mentorship was, may I say, even worse. For example, I would go to the senior therapist in my clinic when I had a problem, when I had a question, and I would ask them for assistance, and they never had anything good to give to me. And I saw the professional experience that I was going to have. I saw that the career that I was walking into was going to be horrible, maybe even torturous. I didn't want to get paid to see these people and bill insurance companies and have them not get better. And then I went into the realm of post-professional education. And through the residency and fellowship process, I had a lot of these impacts that you're talking about. And I firmly believe that if I had not done that training, I would have stepped out of the profession. I would have rather had been an engineer, a cook, a mechanic, anything, as long as I could do something meaningful.
Yeah, and I don't think that the findings here are by any means limited only to the hybrid model. In fact, we had a follow-up conversation as a group of authors on this project to say our next step should be to expand it out to other fellowships to kind of see if it's similar or not. Because I do believe that there's a lot of carryover. I do think it's a testament to this specific program and other programs that do a similar level of connectedness in order to ensure that these are the outcomes, or maybe not ensure, but these end up being some of the outcomes. But I too was in the same issue that you had. I was 1 year out of school. I was working in a very high volume, not interested in outcomes clinic. And within that year, I was already looking at the potential of business school, at law school, etc. I ended up having a really interesting shift in my practice that was brought on by the company with an effort to improve their reimbursement for workers' comp cases. They brought in a high level manual therapist. And that manual therapist taught a lot of us. In fact, we underwent really, really intensive training with all of our weekends given up over a three to 4 month period of time. And during that, it was just this spark like, oh my gosh, this is what physical therapy, specifically outpatient orthopedic centric physical therapy, is supposed to be. Like, this changes everything. So I ended up changing companies because of a very large disagreement in the focus of what practice should be. I thought it should be outcomes versus payment, which I think a lot of us end up running into. And with that, I ended up kind of running in the same thing. I got to a status quo, nothing was changing. And then that brought on, through luck, introduction to a transitional doctorate through St. Augustine, which again, now I had mentorship through that process, and that evolved my practice. After that completed, same thing happened. Now I'm starting to see stagnancy. Now I no matter what clinic I run into, I'm likely the most experienced and have the highest skill set. So yet again, I was considering leaving the profession to go again into either medicine or something similar. And then I just happened to go to a weekend intensive with Jason Rodagiro, and he literally verbatim told me my life story, but in this case, he was describing his life story. And he then described how fellowship completely changed the game. And I said, well, then that's what I got to do. And I did fellowship. And I think the key thing that happens with fellowship is, again, the mentorship, but also the reverse mentorship. As part of the fellowship process, you're also tasked with helping mentor newer grads or residents or some other group. And that starts to teach you, like, it's not all about just improving your skill, but it's improving the game of the rest of our profession. And I think some of the connectedness, I think some of the results of the fellowship really, from our research, enhances, just says, like, this makes you a better person, but it also makes you a better participant in your world. And that, since that has been kind of the main driver. It's always mentorship, and it's always a two-way street, trying to mentor while being mentored. That leads to satisfaction.
We've already sort of covered this, of course, because in part it's the entire conversation, but if you were to give words of wisdom to new graduate physical therapists that are beginning to seek out continuing education opportunities, what's the best advice that you can give them?
So the best advice I could give them is to stick with a system. Now, you can dabble with a few systems. And when I say systems, you can think of the different orthopedic models, be that Maitland, be that Mulligan, be that Ola Grimsby, be that St. Augustine through Stanley Paris's group. Like, you can try the systems, but once you find one that kind of resonates with you, I would say stick with that. And the reason for that is, if you understand one model thoroughly, then you can start to look at the other models and use compare contrast to those models and see how you can evolve your practice. Now, the one thing that I would also say is, through this entire process, you should really look at the evidence behind whatever system you have. And know that the evidence the evidence is really never going to prove anything. It's evidence for something or evidence against something, but never going to prove anything. Your practice is what's going to really hammer home what you're learning and whether it's effective, whether it's not, through your outcomes measure assessment. Now, if you listen to what I just said, it's learn a system, it's make sure you're checking that system through the evidence, and it is making sure that you change your process based off your outcomes specifically to you, which arguably is the same thing that you would get if you were to go through a residency and then you would go through a fellowship. The residency teaches you that basic baseline, and then the fellowship teaches you that higher level, I'm going to reason through this and I'm going to look at my practice and see how my practice is evolving. So I do think the best route is to go through that residency model, wait 3 to 5 years after the residency, do a fellowship. I don't think you should do a fellowship right after. You need a chance to really experiment with the system that you've completed. So I personally believe that you should wait, but that's my personal bias. If you can't do it, then just follow what I said. I would recommend that you learn a system through weekend intensives or weekend courses, finish that system, and then compare contrast whatever other weekend courses you take, while still trying to maintain access to a either PubMed or something like that. And if you go back to what I said about mentorship, even with this level, taking student physical therapists really helps you improve your mentorship, which means you have to know what you're teaching. And obviously, I would hope you would want to know the quality of what you're teaching that student. To make the final connection with the research, if you're taking students, I think it's rightful for you to ask the institution, so the university or college those students are coming from, for access to their PubMed, to their medical library. That way you can get full text articles and be able to make sure that you're checking the evidence behind whatever your practice is.
I think that sounds like sage advice. And as we're beginning to wrap up here, I want to know, are there any projects you're working on? I know earlier you mentioned that you and your co-authors would like to see if these results carry over to the non-hybrid programs. Are you currently working on that? Is that maybe in the future? Or are you busy with other research projects currently?
So I do believe that will be in the future, but I do have other research projects that are going on right now. At the University of Florida, there's a strong tradition of pain science research, and we're under the process or preparing to go through the process of curricular review for our pain science across the curriculum. So we're going to look to see how beliefs in pain mechanisms for our students evolve during the time period that they are in the program. So that's one project. Another project that I'm involved with is looking at resistance training for chronic low back pain and some of the effectiveness there. And then we are also looking at, I'm doing some research also expanding upon pain beliefs in patients. So those are kind of preliminary steps for all of those projects, but those are the main things that I'm currently working on.
Well, Dr. MacPherson, I know we communicate often, but it has been a distinct pleasure to have you on the podcast and be able to communicate in a slightly different way. Also, let me officially and for the record state that your contributions to the podcast have been invaluable. We certainly are lucky to have you on the team, and I think our audience is lucky to be able to learn from the type of work that you're generating in your research.
Well, Steve, I've greatly enjoyed being on the other side of the microphone, and I do want to just kind of finish out by saying I'd like to thank my co-authors, because this my name might have been first, but there was a lot of red ink on the final write-up. So Mark Shepard, Jamie Childs Everett, Adam Fritsch, Julie Whitman, and Kim Dunleavy. But we also received help from Jen Bent and Bobby Russell. Without them, this would have never happened. So even though I'm the one being interviewed, their work is really what was the impetus to get this done.
Well, that sounds like an all-star team, and I'm sure it was fun to work with them. And as is always the case, it seems like we're all just kind of working together and trying to plug ahead to make sure we understand what's going on within the profession and generating research to help us keep moving in the right direction.
Yes, that's what we need.
Well, sir, thank you for joining the podcast, and we'll hear from you soon.
Thank you, Steve. Have an awesome day up there.
You as well. Take care.
This has been a production of the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists. You can learn more about the Academy by visiting our website at aaompt.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by searching for our acronym, AAOMPT. The views and opinions expressed on the AOMPT podcast are those of the interviewers and interviewees and do not represent the official position of AOMPT. The information presented should not be used as personal healthcare or clinical practice advice. If you need to find an expert orthopedic physical therapist near you, then check out the Find a Fellow feature under the Public Resources tab at www.aaompt.org, which you can find in the show notes.